What are the two value systems that are fighting against one another?
So I think it's a value system of extraction and exploitation, right? So of basically trying to dominate and trying to command nature and to really see nature as a resource, as a rather than as a life supporting system, right? So that's one worldview. And the second worldview is one of reciprocity. And we've seen that really adopted and embraced and modeled by indigenous societies all around the world. It's where we live in synergy and in harmony with nature, where we don't see nature as something to dominate, but rather as us being part of a broader system, us being part of the planet rather than us being apart from it. And I think that the economy and the value system that generates out of reciprocity is not one where you profit from the exploitation of nature, or you see it as a financial resource, but rather you see it as more of a regenerative and balanced system. And I think those are kind of in conflict, and we're at the situation where we've seen an accelerating and unregulated growth in our economy that really, quite frankly, is unsustainable and will lead to a collapse of our ecosystem if we don't start to kind of bend that curve and move more towards degrowth or policies that actually don't promote consumption as the basis of our economic model.
So, how do you incentivize extractors to get on board with a more holistic attitude towards existence?
Especially across country lines, right? Because if you have one country that decides to extract less, how do you stop another country from basically deciding that means they can just take more?
Yeah, I think that's fundamentally the issue that we're struggling with right now with climate change, because it's a global problem, and emissions from the United States and emissions from China have the same impact on our atmosphere. So even if one country makes a lot of progress, if another country doesn't, then it undermines the entire system, and it really could backtrack, or it could even negate the progress that we see in other countries. But you also see the other dynamic, which is there's some countries like Pacific Islands or even least developed countries that are least responsible for causing climate change but are suffering the most. So it really goes both ways in terms of how unbalanced it is. In terms of the solutions, I think there are a number of different pressure points. One is ensuring that governments and those that are in charge of organizing our society put in place guardrails that are enforced. So we recognize that there are certain substances that might be harmful for humans, so they're regulated. Or we recognize that the emission or the kind of effluence of certain chemicals into our water or into our air is harmful for human health. It gets regulated, and so companies that are extractive companies have to remediate any negative or harmful impact. So I think government regulation is a really critical and really important component that ensures that actions that won't happen organically are actually built into our framework, our regulatory framework. The second is
Hold on 1 second. I just have a question. I'm sorry. The
sure.
real issue, though, is that governments are paid for by a lot of these extraction companies.
And the fact that nobody trusts their government, right? You're at
Wow, I
what,
wasn't
like,
even going to go there, but
but there's like 12% faith in government right now, in the United States at least, on either side.
hold on, Quinn, 1 sec. That's
Okay,
really
okay,
interesting,
okay,
but
okay.
I really want to understand how you get governments to make actions when their funding sources are in direct conflict with these aims.
That's a good question.
Yeah, you totally hit the nail on the head, because I think in particular the influence of corporations in our political process completely undermines its integrity. If you have corporations that are providing resources to re-elect certain elected officials, then it reduces their incentive to regulate those very same corporations. So I think that campaign finance reform and ensuring that there's cool-off periods among elected officials kind of going back into industry and going back into the private sector are two very simple and important things that need to happen to ensure that we have the proper checks and balances and that there really is integrity in the system.
Are people
Are there
And
countries that are doing that already? Better than others?
um, Probably. I mean, I haven't evaluated the campaign finance regulations and policies of other countries, but I would expect that the Scandinavian countries probably have regulations and policies related to that. I wouldn't be able to name specific ones, but I know that in the United States, I would perceive our political system as being quite influenced by corporations, either explicitly or implicitly, and especially with the Citizens United case, I think it's eroded our ability to enforce those policies. But the other piece is also, elected officials are accountable to the citizenry, and so I think if voters recognize the importance of these issues and elevate them as critical in what they demand in terms of the values of our elected officials, that's also an important driver of change. Is ensuring that we're holding them accountable to higher standards and that we're calling out conflicts of interest we see those cases.
So, how can you incentivize the kind of transparency that will allow conflicts of interest to be apparent?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in a system like in the United States, I think having kind of a wide range of pressure points, including investigative journalism or even putting pressure on companies themselves. So we've seen a lot of this in the climate space where, as we know, there's a large oil lobby and extractive companies have been advocating for or even trying to block regulation of carbon dioxide as a pollutant and have been quite successful to date in doing so. But by mobilizing and engaging youth in divestment movements or mobilizing shareholders to demand that companies set climate commitments and targets, those have actually proven to be really effective in driving the change at the corporate level and holding them accountable, right? For shareholders to hold these companies accountable for not advocating for policies that undermine regulation of carbon dioxide and put us on path to addressing climate change is also another way of doing so. So I don't think we should underestimate the power of individual and community-led advocacy because it has been proven to be effective.
What about, I know that Earth has a history of boycotts being a really effective mechanism, but I don't really see that being a very popular tactic right now. Do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, I think boycotts have been effective in the past. I think we've seen campaigns against, certain brands that use a lot of palm oil. We know that palm oil is one of the largest drivers of deforestation.
So actually, hold on, let me pause you for a second. Palm oil is actually a really interesting example because on one hand, it is a driver of deforestation, but on the other hand, it's also this massive economic powerhouse for the countries that produce it. And so you have these two forces that need to be balanced, one of which is saving these ancient forests that have been untouched for millions of years, even by natural disasters. But on the other hand, you have millions and millions of people in abject poverty for whom palm oil is the only way out.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Palm oil is a highly productive, high-yielding crop. And so in particular for communities that are impoverished or are looking for a livelihood, palm oil is quite lucrative because it can, in particular, palm oil, when it's grown on cleared forest, you have two sources of income. You have timber, so you can sell whatever it is that you extract from that land. And then when you replant palm oil on deforested land, you have the second source of income, which is the palm oil itself as it grows and is harvested. And in terms of productivity, there really isn't a clear parallel or one that can actually generate as much or is as easy to grow or as easy to actually harvest as palm oil. So we recognize and we know that palm oil itself is really important for the local economy of countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, and also for local communities that depend on palm oil for their livelihoods. So I think that your initial question was about boycotting. And there have been huge movements against brands like Nutella or even Kit Kat because of their use of palm oil. And I think in some ways some of those campaigns did backfire because they basically set up a binary, decision. There was this polarity: buy palm oil or don't, but really neglected to highlight the middle ground, which is that palm oil is really important for local communities and for the economies of these countries. And it can be farmed and cultivated and produced sustainably. The problem that we have is when these commodities are produced unsustainably. So when they're planted on illegally deforested land, or they're planted without on peatland, which is a very, very high carbon density ecosystem. It's basically like a wetland, and you must have seen that we had big fires in Indonesia and Malaysia over the past few years because of the drainage of this peat. Palm oil should not be planted on peat. It is not the right type of soil profile for palm oil to grow. But because of an unsustainable expansion of palm oil, it has been planted in those areas. So, what we should be advocating for is not a boycott of palm oil, but rather a push for sustainable palm oil, so that we can cultivate and produce this commodity that is so important for so many of our personal care use products, or even for food and for the livelihoods of communities, but also to provide an important counterweight against the pressure to deforest. If you don't have a source of income, you don't have an incentive to keep forests standing. So that's really what I work at an organization called Conservation International, and that's really what we focus on, is on creating the incentives for sustainably certified palm oil, and for governments to enforce the use of these practices, and for communities to benefit from sustainable palm oil as well.